This week, I was gonna say today, but this week, we are going to be talking about the new Jim Crow, race and crime. So, this lecture is very important, and there's going to be a lot of history in this lecture. So if you like history, if you are in Africana Studies, which I also teach Africana Studies classes as well. So this piece kind of blends in the Africana Studies and the history and the sociology here. So if you like all that stuff, then you might like this lecture. But we're going to talk a lot about history, a lot about sociology, and also criminology. I don't know if any of you major in criminology or take classes in criminology, or you're interested in that. But if you are, then you would like this lecture. So what we're talking about is race, the criminal justice system, and crime. And at the very foundation of this kind of discourse is really what sits at the foundation of many forms of oppression, which is fear. A fear of another person having power, a fear of being oppressed, a fear of being eliminated, a fear of losing power. There are levels of fear that exist that become the impetus for multi-level modes of oppression and interlocking modes of oppression. And when that fear is systematized, then institutions and policies and traditions and the ignoring of tradition are now put in place to help instill and profit off of that fear. And so it's very important when we talk about race, institutions, and the Black body as a criminal element, it's extremely important that we start with fear. The fear of the Black body is where all of this begins. And before we get into that, I want you to watch this YouTube link. Very short, 3 to 4 minutes or so, where Ta-Nehisi Coates is talking about the Black body as a criminal element, the criminal justice system, and mass incarceration. So I want you to watch it and then come back, and then we're going to do a kind of historical look at how we got to this point. Okay. All right. So when we talk about this fear of the Black body, and we see how it has led to the system of mass incarceration, and we're going to talk more about that in a second, it's very important that we start from the beginning. And this fear, I would argue, doesn't necessarily start with slavery. There wasn't a strong fear of Black people, of African people, during this time, because there was an entire system put in place to oppress them. Now, it did not necessarily mean that when Black people fought back, when they would, kill their so-called masters in their sleep, or run away, or, burn down the plantation, or burn down homes, or do things to resist and rebel against slavery, it didn't necessarily mean that it instilled a certain level of fear. But as a system, as a country, it wasn't a whole, it was very difficult, right? The system was still on their side, on the side of white people. However, once slavery was over and white people were granted citizenship, and white people now had opportunities, and Black people, slavery was over, Black people now had opportunities. Black people were now so-called free. Now they were no longer enslaved, and some of them could get an education and get a job. They had skills, and many of them were able to make more than many of their white counterparts because they didn't get paid as much. So they had more opportunities to work, and the more they worked, the more money they made. And they started businesses, and they bought their own land, and all these opportunities, and especially particularly in the South. And so what that did was that created a fear among white people, a fear of not so much Black people taking over or oppressing them or enslaving them or going to war with them and killing them. I don't know if it was as much as that, as much as there was a fear of Black success. There was a fear that if we give them too much freedom, if we give them too much room, they might take over. They could go from being enslaved to sharecroppers, to educators, to teachers, to business people, to CEOs and senators, and they could even be the president if we allow this to happen. So we will now, so there's less of a fear of their life and more of a fear of losing power, right? Losing their social status, particularly in the South. And so when African Americans had the opportunity to vote, and they began to do that in the middle to the latter part of the 1960s, when there was an amendment passed that gave Black people the right to vote, this is when the Klan rose, right? And the Ku Klux Klan became popular. I think it was in Tennessee. The first wave of the Klan became popular in Tennessee. And the Klan and other predominantly white, what were they called? Vigilante efforts were organized around this time to instill fear and to intimidate Black people so that they would not vote, right? So they wouldn't vote, so they wouldn't gain power, so they would be afraid to get an education, so that they would be afraid to rise, or so that they would be afraid to better themselves. But particularly it was around voting. If there was a voting drive, or if there was a church that was encouraging African Americans to vote, you would find the Klan come and they would burn crosses, and they would do things to intimidate these people so that they would not vote, because they knew that voting was power. And if you were able to have an influence over who is in office, that person in office can pass policies that will help you, right? So this is when lynching, right, became a thing. This is when we started to see lynching, particularly from the lynching era is said to be from the 1880s to about the 1930s. And it was during this time that you start to see this form of intimidation happening, where these white vigilante efforts, white vigilante organizations, Ku Klux Klan and the like, they would choose African Americans, Black people, particularly Black men, a lot of Black women though, but a lot of times you would see Black men. And for whatever reason, they would make up a reason. Sometimes there wouldn't even be a reason, but most times they would make up a reason to say, well, this person broke the law, this person violated, a rule that we have in this country or in this town or whatever. They violated a rule and now they have to be punished. And then they would grab these people and they would lynch them, right? And lynching, you've probably seen pictures or documentaries. They would hang them from a tree until they died and then set them on fire. And there were various forms of lynching, right? Typically, this was done to Black people, African Americans, sometimes Jewish people, every once in a while, few white people, but maybe like 90% was African Americans. And so this was done to, again, instill fear. Now, there is this myth that the reason why a lot of African Americans were lynched was because they were accused, particularly men, they were accused of raping or sexually assaulting or mistreating white women. And so oftentimes what you'll find is in documentaries or in historical narratives, they'll say, well, he was accused of misconduct towards a white woman. And so the white men felt that they had to protect white women by making sure that these men who were trying to push up on them or trying to rape them or sexually assault them were dealt with properly so that they did not oppress or mistreat white women. So that was the idea, and that you see actually that in a lot of scholarly research as well, particularly older scholarly research around lynching. But if we go back to Ida B. Wells, who was a phenomenal Black woman, one of the founders of the NAACP, she was a scholar, she was a researcher, she was a sociologist. With W.E.B. Du Bois helped found the NAACP. Her book, I think it was called The Red Book or The Red Scare, was a historical. She did historical statistics on lynching. She was from Mississippi, eventually moved to Memphis, and then eventually moved to Chicago. And she was one of the leaders of the anti-lynching movement during that time. And what she found, even in the early part of the 20th century, was that a majority of African Americans who were lynched were not lynched because they did rape a white woman or sexually assaulted a white woman, or even were accused of it. In many situations, many of them were not even in the place where the so-called interaction happened. So we know now that that was a myth. We know now that these people, many of these people were not accused, and even if they were accused, the likelihood of them actually doing it was very, 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 very small. And so lynching was not done to protect white women, but that was just used as a scapegoat, as a so-called justification for really enacting this fear of losing power. And two, so number one, enacting the fear of losing power, and number two, enacting this personal, individual, and structural control over Black bodies. And so it is from this time period, it is from these actions that you start to get this notion of the Black man as the criminal stereotype. Because generally what would happen is a person would be lynched, but before they were lynched, the crowd, the group, or sometimes they might have been even taken to court, and they were found guilty of some type of crime, particularly, doing something negative, sexually assaulting a white woman. But it could have been stealing an apple. It could have been looking a white person in the eye. It was some type of infraction. And whether it was in the court of law or whether it was the court of public opinion, they were found guilty. Sometimes they were put in jail, then taken away and lynched, or sometimes they were just lynched on the spot. These types of things happen, but this is the foundation for the Black male criminalized stereotype, right? This leads us also into other forms of that, including the chain gang. Oh my goodness, so much. You got the chain gang, you got the penal system. So we can go on and on. We're not gonna go into all of that right now. But if you were to take an Africana Studies class, we would absolutely delve deeper into that. But right now, I don't wanna go off too much. So I'll just stay right there. But that is where you start to get the beginning of this idea of the Black man as the criminal stereotype. And then you start to see this evolution of the Black criminal. So before, the Black criminal could have been just any Black person, particularly a Black man, right? Any Black person. And they were seen as criminal just because of the color of their skin. And then over time, as you get closer to the civil rights movement and you start to see more and more resistance from Black men, particularly Black leaders, Black male leaders and Black women leaders, now you start to see that the Black male criminal is now becoming not just any Black man, but particularly the Black man that is causing ruckus, that is causing revolutions, that is initiating resistance, the one that is causing trouble, right? And so now, instead of looking at all Black men as or in addition to looking at Black men as the criminal stereotype, now it is the one that is the leader, that is influencing the rest of the community, the rest of the race, with these ideas around integration and empowerment and self-determination. And so we have to remember that it wasn't just the so-called criminals or lower class or people that were doing something wrong during that time, but Dr. King, like Ta-Nehisi Coates said in the video, at one point was considered one of the most dangerous men in the world. He was considered a criminal, where they actually, tapped his phones. They had pages and pages and pages of FBI reports on his everyday life. Same thing with Malcolm X. Same thing with Angela Davis, right? These were people, very educated people, very respected people, very spiritual people, who were still seen as a criminal element because they did not subscribe to the status quo. They did not subscribe to the racism and to the way and the normalcy of life as it was in the United States at that time. And so because of that, they were labeled criminals. So criminals aren't always somebody who actually does something wrong or even accused of doing something wrong. Sometimes a criminal is someone who goes against what is seen as normal. As we know, Malcolm X, after he converted to the Nation of Islam and he became a Muslim, we have no evidence of him actually committing an actual criminal act. Dr. King, same thing. We have no evidence of him actually committing a criminal act. Angela Davis, same thing. But these were people who were seen as dangerous because they did not subscribe to the status quo, because they did not take and accept what was said about them and how they and their people were being treated. So then after that time, so this is around the 1960s and 70s, then, and if you took my race, place, and inequality class, we talk about the influx of crack cocaine in predominantly Black areas, particularly predominantly Black urban areas. We also talked about mass incarceration and the creation of hip hop and all these other different things that have shaped Black masculinity. And so from there, we start to see how the criminal mind, the criminal description of the Black male moved from the revolutionary, from your Dr. Kings, your Malcolm X, your Angela Davises, to now the drug dealer, right? Because around the 1970s and the 1980s, this is when you start to see a big influx of drugs into the United States, but particularly into Black communities. And so from here, you see this, and then you see the removing of the Black men out of the communities. You see the removing of the Black middle class and Black professionals out of predominantly Black communities. And you start to see a divestment and underinvestment in predominantly Black urban communities. So because of that, you have high rates of unemployment, and many criminologists will tell you when unemployment rises, crime rises, regardless of the race. People don't have jobs, people can't take care of their family, they're gonna find a way to take care of their family, right? So then what do? Well, we want to have some type of economic system here. Let's flood these areas of unemployment and underemployment with drugs. Now they can take care of their families, but in a way that is illegal. And then that gives the larger society a reason to come in, take those people out of their communities and create an entirely different system of economic, of high economic proportion, and use that to now help undergird or create a wealth building project for the privilege, for the racialized privilege, or for the racial privilege, for the class privilege, which we call the mass incarceration system. We call the prison industrial complex. And so now you have the evolution of the Black criminal from this so-called Black rapist in the early part of the 20th century to the revolutionary, to now the drug dealer in the 70s and 80s, to now these people who are considered to be violent criminals now, right? So this is the evolution of the Black criminal element. And so I just talked about this. So now we have in our current society what we call the new plantation, or what is called the new plantation, which is the prison industrial complex. In this new plantation, or looking at it as a different way of enslaving people of color, particularly Black people, enslaving them, which is why Michelle Alexander calls this book The New Jim Crow, because she's saying this is another way of reducing Black people to second-class citizenship. You can't enslave them. Jim Crow is supposed to be outlawed. So what do? Well, we take these people, we label them criminals, even if they're not, and then we put them into this system that makes them work for a quarter, a penny, a nickel. And they're literally making millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars. They're literally building highways, they're building buildings, they're building universities, they're constructing everything in the United States for quarters, for nickels, for pennies. And people are making billions. That's a whole industry that is built off of prison labor, which is a form of slave labor, right? So that's why it's called the prison industrial complex. And so the reason why, or how it is described, is you have all of these various interest groups, whether it be government, whether it be industry, policy, farming, that are all used to survey, to police, and to promote imprisonment as solutions to the economic, social, and political problems that lie in the United States. If there's a drug problem, what do? And we're getting ready to talk about this in a second. There's a drug problem in society, what do? Lock up the drug dealers. If there's a drug problem and this is in the 80s in Black communities, there's a drug problem in Black communities, what do? We lock up those drug users. Why are they on drugs? They shouldn't be on drugs. They're bad, they're a criminal element in our society, lock them up. Who's giving them the drug? Drug dealers. Get them, let's lock them up, right? And so that is the way in which we deal with it. And that's why it's called the prison industrial complex, because now you create this whole industry that is used to help build wealth for the already privileged, small privileged group. So it is this expansive network of people and of parties that have a vested interest in mass incarceration. And understanding this prison industrial complex helps us uncover how all of these networks are used to fill up the prisons and to support this incarceration for their own interests. Soon, we will then begin to see how even schools and education, what you call those schools? Not private schools, but charter schools. You have banks. The same banks over certain charter schools are also the same banks that have a vested interest in prisons. And so because they have a vested interest in both, it makes sense to create a way for schools to function like prisons to prepare certain students who don't pass or who don't score a certain grade or are not of a certain academic standard, to prepare them subtly for the prison system. And then what happens? They get money on both ends. It's a win-win situation. Capitalism at its finest. That's what we call the school to prison pipeline, right? So these are the things that occur within the prison industrial complex. And if we look at the numbers, if we look at the statistics, approximately 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the United States. 4.5 million people are on probation or parole, which makes the United States the world's the country that has the world's highest incarceration. And you have other countries with a larger population. So the United States incarcerates more people than Russia, in China, who has 1 billion people. They have 1 billion people in China. I think the United States might have like some 100,000 or something, 300, 400,000. No, million, sorry, not thousand, million, something like that. But definitely, I would imagine less than half of China, and still incarcerates the most people in the world. That's a problem, right? The prison industrial complex has a network of private, not only prisons, but also, and we're gonna see in a second, we're gonna look at a chart where there is about how immigration detention centers have now been added to the prisons in terms of institutions that are used to help expand this prison industrial complex. They have become the default for imprisoning undocumented immigrants for a certain amount of time. So instead of putting them in traditional prisons, now they have immigrant detention centers for undocumented people in the United States. And so these immigration detention centers are now expanding what we call the new plantation, expanding the new Jim Crow, right? To not just affect Black people now, but now it is also affecting other people of color, particularly undocumented people, right? So if we look at this chart, we just kind of see the numbers. In 2000, the total prison population was 1,381,892. In 2016, the prison population was 1,505,400, which surprisingly, that's actually not that bad. Considering the jump, and you're getting ready to see it in a second, considering the jump from the 1970s to the 1980s, and from 1980 to like 1988, and then in the Bush and Clinton era, it was crazy, from like 88 to like 97. I mean, the percentage rate was like, probably like, definitely maybe over 100% in terms of its increase. This is only a 9% increase, which is actually not that bad. Still a lot of people. United States still incarcerates the most people, but has actually so-called gotten better. It's still not better, but the percentage in terms of people that are being incarcerated have actually decreased. And we're still at 1,500,000, which lets you know that what was done in the 1980s and 1990s is still affecting us today, and people are also still benefiting from it today. Total private prisons, though, have risen from 87,000 to 128,000, so more than 50%, or almost 50%. Federal private prisons have grown from 15,000 to 34,000, 120%. State private prisons from 71,000 to 94,000, 31%. But look at this private immigration detention. That's why we wanted to talk about this. This private immigration detention centers has risen from 4,841 in 2000 to 26,000. That's 442%. So now undocumented immigrants, undocumented people are the newer victims of the prison industrial complex. So that is something that we need to continue to look at and pay attention to, because that number is astronomical. 442%. Growing immigration, private detention centers for undocumented people, right? So very, very important. So we're gonna stop, or we're gonna just take a quick break right there so we can talk a little bit about this class assignment that I want you to do, and then we'll go into the myth. We'll go into a little bit of the book, and then we'll talk about the myth of the model. We'll talk about the new Jim Crow. All right, so you have a class assignment, and for this assignment, you are required to watch the documentary below called 13th. Some of you may have seen it before, some of you may have not, but it's called 13th. I know it's very popular, so still, some of you may have seen it in high school or college, or may have done some kind of assignment with it. So while watching the documentary, I do want you to answer some specific questions. And those questions can be found under the class assignments tab that says 13th assignment. And as you're watching this documentary, I want you to find the answers to some of these questions, okay? And I want you to record the answers on a separate Microsoft Word document. And then once you have completed all the questions, I want you to upload your answers to the assignments tab that says 13th assignment. If you're still confused, please see the lecture video for this PowerPoint where I explain in more detail. So essentially what I want you to do, there's gonna be questions about this documentary. So I want you to watch it, and then as you're watching it, I want you to answer the questions. So they're gonna be in order. So you don't have to like skip around or anything. So they're gonna be in order, you're gonna watch it, you're going to answer those questions, and then you're going to upload that, and that is your class assignment. And a lot of it is just reinforcing the different things that we have been discussing, for in this lecture, things that you've read. And so go ahead and do that. Now, documentary might be pretty long. So if I were you, even if you just want to do the assignment first before you continue, some people are saying, oh, it's a lot to listen to the lecture, do the readings, and do the assignment in those 5 days. Or, you know, by the time you get this on Sunday night, Monday morning, and for some people are, or not really some, just one person, are saying that it's been a lot to try to get this done. If I were you, then I would suggest for an assignment like this, where you don't have to know the reading to do it, just go ahead and do this first, right? I would highly suggest that you don't wait till Thursday to see this. So hopefully you're seeing this on Sunday night, Monday, maybe even Tuesday. Just go ahead and just, you know, take an hour or two while you're watching the documentary, do your assignment, and then upload that, okay? But keep in mind that this is a 3 credit hour course. So because of that, at least 3 hours of the week, you need to be engaging with this material. You need to be reading, you need to be watching his lectures, and you need to be doing assignments. So it's just like if you were in class. So that's how the lectures are kind of laid out, as if, so you have about 2 to 3 hours worth of lectures a week. If we were in class, that's why you have 2 to 3 hours worth of lectures in these videos. So that's what I'm required to do. So just giving you all a heads up for those people who are finding it difficult to complete the assignments. If you're not, and you know you're good, then don't worry about it. If you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, and now we can move on. So moving on to what was talked about, some more of what was talked about in the book. I want you to watch this quick video link. It's like a clip from a movie. It's a comedy with Martin Lawrence, but there's something deep in there. Even though it's funny, it's something deep in there that, and a message that he's sending out. So I want you to click on that link. It's kind of a, you know, what they call a bootleg version. But if you can see it, definitely want to kind of spark your thoughts when it comes to this. All right, so what underlying message is being portrayed in this scene by the character of the police officer, right? So what kind of messages do you see? And what message is Montgomery trying to send with this, right? So with this training, Montgomery, which is the person, Martin Lawrence, the black guy who's shooting, he's playing this character, Montgomery, and he has to come into a place really quickly, boom. And he has to figure out who he's gonna shoot, who he's gonna kill. He has to make split-second decisions to find out who is the criminal and who's not. And so he does it, he completes the training, and then they ask him, okay, you shot this person, all these people, why didn't you shoot the black guy in the middle? And he says, well, why would I shoot him? He's a black guy surrounded by all these white people. Obviously, he's terrified. If I was a black guy surrounded by a lot of white people, I would be terrified, right? And it's a joke, right? It's a, you know, he makes a little joke at the end or whatever, it's a comedy. But there's a little bit of sincerity, there's a little bit of honesty in that. Because it implies that any other officer, particularly any other white officer doing that training, probably would have saw him, the big black guy in the middle, and shot him first. He looks like the criminal, right? He's mean looking, he's big, he looks like the criminal. But the black guy who understands what it's like to be a black guy surrounded by white people or in a certain situation, or probably have seen people that look like him but are not criminals, may look at that person and say, he doesn't look like a criminal to me. He may look like a criminal to society, but not to me. And so what that does is it causes us to think about this notion of stereotypes and selective vision. Let's turn to page 73 in essay 7. And what we see is this notion of implicit bias. All right. And if we look at what Rashawn Ray, who's a very prominent sociologist about criminal justice, what we see is we see this, or he talks about Trayvon Martin. And he talks about how Trayvon Martin is stereotyped for being this criminal, for someone who was not supposed to be in a certain space. His hoodie, right? The way he looks, he was tall, he was black, and he was walking in a neighborhood. And so there is this implicit bias that he has to be doing something wrong. Let me respond. And the response causes a tussle, and then it leads to the death of Trayvon Martin. And so, again, there is this implicit bias that exists in many people, particularly when it comes to race and crime. And the stereotype is that Black people, or particularly Black men, specifically ones of a certain stature, are said to be criminals or be up to no good, or have the likelihood of them committing a criminal act is stronger. That leads to this idea of stereotypes right here on page 73. And stereotypes at the bottom says that these are oversimplified sets of beliefs about members of a particular group. Anytime we have, and notice, I like how they say that it's oversimplified, meaning there are these ideas based on very little to no facts. It causes no critical analysis, no depth of understanding in any way, shape, or form, but based off of very simple observations that we create a set of beliefs around not just one person, not just two people, but a whole group of people. That's what we call stereotypes. And that is what exists when we have a certain level of implicit bias about a group. And then when we have these stereotypes, this leads us to what we call selective perception. And selective perception means that after we've already labeled or placed stereotypes on a certain group of people, now when we see those people, we only see the behaviors that confirm the stereotypes. We don't see anything that refutes the stereotype. So we create the stereotype, and then we have selective perception. So for George Zimmerman, there was a stereotype of a Black criminal. He said there had been break-ins already in the neighborhood. He probably had in his mind, these guys must be Black. So he already created a stereotype of a Black criminal and what they might look like. They're Black, scary looking, tall, big, probably wearing a hoodie. Already has that in his mind. So now when he sees Trayvon Martin, he doesn't see anything that refutes the stereotype. He doesn't see, oh, this is a kid who actually makes good grades in high school, which he did. This is a kid who has goals and dreams of becoming something successful. This kid does not sell drugs. This kid is not a gangster. There's nothing that refutes the stereotype, but instead, as soon as he sees them, he automatically sees all of the stereotypes that he's created in his head. Not to mention the fear, remember we talked about fear, of break-ins. So you mix fear and you mix that with stereotypes, you have a bad situation. I'm scared and I already think that you're going to do something wrong, so I'm going to respond in an aggressive way. And the person that's being stereotyped against, the victim, may not have time to think all of this stuff through. All they're saying is this person is being assertive towards me. I need to protect myself. I don't know who you are. Now we have this tension. Unfortunately for Trayvon Martin, a situation that tension turned fatal. So let's go to page 76, essay and essay 7, where we again talk more about this notion of selective perception. So on page 76, in the first two and then even 3 paragraphs, Rashawn Ray is saying, a lot of people say, well, he shouldn't have been wearing that hoodie. You know, that hoodie, that's a very, clandestine type of clothing. Right? People who wear hoodies, we're not saying it's because he's black. No, we're not talking about race. We're just talking about it was because of that hoodie. If he wouldn't have worn that hoodie, then George Zimmerman probably would not have thought that he had done something wrong, and he would have been okay. Obviously, that's stupid. But let's just say, just for argument's sake, let's just say, okay, let's not focus on the race part. I'll play the race card too much. You play the race card. Okay, we're not going to focus on the race card, or we're not going to focus on race. Let's just talk about the hoodie. We're going to use that and analyze that. He should not have worn a hoodie because hoodies promote a criminal element. Hoodies mean crime. People who wear hoodies are probably going to commit crimes. Well, if we use that approach, let's look at different people that wear hoodies. One approach to test this claim is to look at other social contexts where individuals wear hoodies to see if those individuals are perceived as suspicious or innocuous. One person who wears a hoodie frequently is Facebook founder CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg wears hoodies during casual encounters and even professional meetings. See examples, or you can Google Mark Zuckerberg in a hoodie, and you'll find many examples. It's what he likes to wear. And I have yet to see evidence of Zuckerberg before he was a billionaire or after he was a billionaire, where he was perceived as a criminal. Well, that's just one example. Okay. And we don't know. We haven't seen a whole lot of Zuckerberg. He's not on TV a lot. We don't know what he wears. Fine. Let's look at the example of New England Patriots head football coach, Bill Belichick. I don't watch a whole lot of football now, but when I did, Bill Belichick wore hoodies every game. Even if he was playing somewhere in the hot sun, even if he was playing in Miami, he wore a hoodie. And there's no evidence to show that Bill Belichick has ever been perceived as a criminal. The white guy that wears a hoodie. So this is just two of many examples of white people who wear hoodies that have never faced or would even think that they would be faced with the same fate as Trayvon Martin, which goes to show that number one, it's not just about the hoodie. So to try to explain away race would make absolutely no sense. And number two, selective perception is real. And the selective perception does not have to do with the article of clothing. Selective perception has to do with who is wearing the article of clothing. What group is wearing the article of clothing? And then we could break this down even further and talk about place, but I won't do that. I'll just stay right here. right? So this notion of stereotypes and this selective perception is an important part of why we of how we get to this notion of fear, control of the body, and what people feel they have to do to maintain power. So with that being said, let's go to the last part of this lecture, which is the war on drugs. So now we're jumping further into, and all these readings have kind of informed each other. So a lot of what Michelle Alexander talked about is in the essays. A lot of what was talked about in the essays Michelle Alexander discussed. So you see a lot of it, okay? But this one, we're delving deeper into Michelle Alexander's book, Reading the New Jim Crow. And we're going to talk more about drugs. So now we're going to, again, talk a little bit about Africana studies, a lot about some about sociology as well, and basically the history of the war on drugs and how it relates to what we've been talking about this notion of the Black body as this criminal element. So first, when we talk about the war on drugs, we have to start with Richard Nixon. A lot of people believe that the war on drugs, well, actually, we're going to go back further than that. A lot of people think the war on drugs started with Ronald Reagan, but it really started with Nixon. And the reason why it started with Nixon is because he was the first one to state that there needed to be a war on drugs. Why? Well, drugs and the racialization of drugs dates all the way back to the first anti-opium laws in the 1870s. When opium was found in China, it was said to be a Chinese drug, right? And so when it was found in the United States, a lot of people connected opium and poppy seeds to Chinese people. And so that's when you start to see, that was probably the first time that there was a type of race that was assigned to a drug that I can think of. I can't think of. So that actually didn't start with Black people. It started with Chinese people. And then in the early part of the 20th century, the first anti-cocaine laws in the South were directed at Black men in the early 1900s. And then the first anti-marijuana laws in the 1910s and the 1920s, those were directed at Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. So it was said that early Black people, or Black people in the early part of the 20th century, were using cocaine and weed and marijuana was connected to Mexican and Mexican immigrants. So drugs were always connected to some race, is what we're saying. And so today, Latino and Black communities are the ones that are more likely to be subject to disproportionate drug laws and racist drug practices. In fact, Black and Latino people are more likely to be stereotyped as drug users and drug dealers more than white people. So in June 1971, President Nixon says that we need to declare a war on drugs. He's saying drugs are ruining American communities, they're ruining lives, and we need to stop it. Because you start to have, I guess, a more common use of drugs. Now, before that, drugs were used, drugs have always been a thing. I mean, even alcohol is a drug, but drugs were always used as by people who had money. Hollywood stars, musicians, stockbrokers, Wall Street people. People who had money could afford drugs. But as you get into this 1960s and 1970s, drugs become cheaper. And now some more middle class, more working class people are able to use drugs. They can afford them now. And so some people were arguing that the increase in drug use, there was an increase in drug use that persisted in the United States. And so what Nixon did was he increased the size and presence of FBAs, right? He pushed these measures so that there would be mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. Meaning if you have a warrant to arrest somebody, you could just bust into their apartment, into their house, and you can arrest them. Or mandatory sentencing where no matter what the situation is, if you did this crime, the mandatory sentence you will have is 15 years. It was Nixon who started that whole process. And he even put marijuana as a Schedule I drug, the most restrictive category of drugs. Even though now, and they were saying this even back then, it should not be. It is not as addictive as even alcohol, and alcohol is legal. Right? So the presidency of Ronald Reagan marked the start of the skyrocketing rates of incarceration. So because of this expansion of the war on, drugs, the number of people behind bars going from, well, it's actually after Nixon, and the expansion of it started with Reagan. From Reagan's era till closer to the end of Clinton's era, 1997. So from 1980 to 1997, the drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. 400,000. So when we were talking about those percentages in that other graph, those percentages can't compare to the height of the drug era. Between 1980 and 1997, the population of drug law offenses increased in the United States from 50,000 to 400,000. This is why mass incarceration was and is an epidemic. So some of you may remember this, depending on how old you are, some may not. The expansion of the war on drugs, the increase in funding for federal agents to do no-knock warrants and mandatory sentencing and all the policies that were put in place because of the war on drugs, it led to campaigns like Dare and Just Say No. When I was younger in the 80s and 90s, there was a big program, Dare and Just Say No, to help push for these anti-drug policies. And in the late 80s, there was this hysteria about drugs and the draconian penalties in Congress and state legislators that increased the prison population. So then you get to about Bill Clinton's era. So you're talking like 1992. And Bill Clinton actually advocated for treatment instead of incarceration during his campaign. He said, you know what, we shouldn't be locking these people up. We need to find ways to help them. This is a mental health, this is a health crisis. But when he got into office, he reneged. He was pressured by Republican predecessors. He was pressured by the Republican Party. He was pressured by a lot of people, even many Democrats. And he began to expand the war on drugs even more. He rejected US sentencing recommendations to eliminate the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. But even within the same drug, there are racial disparities. Crack cocaine is a more desensitized version of pure cocaine. Crack cocaine was a lot cheaper than pure cocaine. So crack cocaine was smoked by mostly poor people, and it was labeled a black drug. Pure cocaine was smoked by rich people with money, rich or middle-class people, so it was seen as a white drug, even though it's the same drug. Even though it's the same drug. And so because of that, but because one is labeled the black drug, one is labeled the white drug, you can get more time for one over the other. And so Clinton's administration said, we have to do something about that, but he rejected it, right? He rejected all kinds of programs that would have helped turn this into a health issue as opposed to a criminal issue. And then right before he left office, he said, we really need to re-examine our entire policy on imprisonment of people who use drugs, and said that marijuana use should be decriminalized right before he left office. So Clinton has always been lauded for his time in office and being president for the people, particularly for Black people, because employment increased during his time in office and all these different things. But employment increased, particularly in prisons, because he built so many, because the prison industry was booming during his time in office. That's actually where those jobs came from, right? So a lot of times what we know about prisons, criminal justice system, we learn from TV shows, right? Like Law and Order and NYPD Blue, Criminal Minds. But Michelle Alexander is telling us, don't believe everything you see. We see on the TV and we see in movies, people go, they get arrested, they get put in jail. Next scene, they're in front of they're being interrogated. Next scene, they're in court. That's not how it works. If we go to the next slide, it's important that we bust these myths. A lot of people are not going to court. They're not getting a fair trial. Most of the time, what ends up happening is they end up taking a deal, because a lot of times the victims have no idea that they're taking a deal that's going to put them in the criminal justice system for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Another myth buster: conviction of drug offenses led to increased incarceration rates. But that is a myth. Or there are myths around this idea. Number one, drug offenses account for about 2/3 of federal inmate population. That means most of the people who are in jail for non-violent crimes. These people have not hurt directly anybody. They are in jail for selling drugs, doing drugs, being around drugs, but there is no violence. In fact, most people in prison have no history of violence. And marijuana has already been proven to be less harmful than tobacco or alcohol, but it still represents 80% of the drug arrests in the 1990s. 80%. For a so-called drug that is not as harmful as drugs that are legal. Again, this is why we're saying this is less about health, or this is less about the drug itself and more about who is doing the drug. That's why we started this conversation off in that way. Another myth buster: war is aimed at ridding the nation of drug kingpins. No, it's not. The war on drugs is not necessarily out to get a Pablo Escobar. It's not out to get a Carlos Slim. It's not out to get the big time drug dealers, the ones who are running the operations. In fact, a lot of those people work with the government, and a lot of police officers and politicians work for them or work with them. So it's not aimed at getting the drug kingpins. Most of the people that they end up busting are those people who are the low-level dealers. Another myth is that the war on drugs is concerned with getting rid of dangerous drugs. No. Marijuana is less dangerous than cigarettes or alcohol, but 80% of the drug offenses are because of marijuana. So clearly it's not about the dangerous drugs. All right, next slide. So we want to talk a little bit about the policies around this topic. Search and seizure, Fourth Amendment. Some of you may know the Fourth Amendment. Next slide. The Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution states that the right of the people to be secure protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So, who knows where this came from? Fourth Amendment. Why did the so-called forefathers and foremothers of this country, why do you think that was important to them, that they wrote that down? The Fourth Amendment was written down because during colonial times, when the United States, when the colonists wanted to protest and boycott Britain because they were being taxed but weren't represented, no taxation without representation. You probably remember that term, that phrase. Many times they would boycott by buying goods from other countries. They would not buy tea from Britain. They might buy tea from Spain, or they might buy paper from the French. They might buy something from the Dutch, but they would not buy from Britain. Great Britain's economy began to crumble because of that. Not crumble, but they felt the effects. And so Great Britain began to send their soldiers over to the colonies and say, hey, if you see anybody who has contraband, meaning they're buying something from another country, take it and confiscate it. And so these British soldiers would come into random homes in Boston and Philly and North Carolina and South Carolina and all over the 13 colonies. And if they wanted to, they could just randomly come into your home with guns, tell you to sit on the floor, and they look at your papers, they look at your stamps, they look at your tea, they look at everything in your house and see if you have any contraband. If you do, they take you to jail. If they do, they get rid of it. So when the people who are considered to be forefathers and foremothers of this country sat down and wrote the Constitution, they said, we remember how we felt when Britain would come in and search our area without any probable cause. So we are not going to do this to our people. You need some kind of just cause before you can search a person's being. Now, at the time, they didn't have cars, but their homes, and then it expanded to cars later on. That's why search and seizure is a part of the Fourth Amendment. Now, a lot of constitutional civil liberties have been undermined because of the war on drugs, one of those being the Fourth Amendment, Terry versus Ohio. In this case, this actually happened. And now if an officer observes unusual conduct by someone and believes that they're dangerous or engaging in criminal activity, they can conduct a limited search to protect themselves or the area. So they're now allowed to do a limited search, not a deep search, but a limited search if they get the suspicion that something wrong is happening. This is where you get the term stop and frisk. Stop and frisk was a campaign, a policy that was put in place in New York in the 90s and in the 2000s that basically gave police officers the right to stop anybody who they thought were criminals. Gave them the right to stop them and do a search, meaning they would take them, and if you type in stop and frisk, Google it on YouTube, you'll see it. They would take them, sometimes they would throw them up against the wall, or as soon as they would see them, the victims would go against the wall, they would kneel down, and the police would search them for drugs, for guns, for anything that they thought they might have. Now, what's wrong with this rule? What is wrong with this rule? How does this rule relate to something we just talked about when we were looking at these essays? And if you said selective perception, you're right. This rule reinforces selective perception, meaning if the police officer already sees Black people as criminals, And now they have the power to use whatever they believe to enact some type of physical contact. Who are the people that are going to be most likely the victims of a stop and frisk rule? Black people. And that's exactly what they found. 100, 200, 300% more likely to be stopped and frisked in New York, and this happened in other areas too, but particularly in New York, way more likely than white people. Because police officers already had the selective perception that these people were the ones that had the guns, that had the drugs, that were of a criminal element. Okay. Another issue is that citizens don't know that there are sometimes questions that they don't have to answer. So many times, a lot of citizens are not informed that they don't have to answer certain questions when being asked. But because by the time you're pulled over by the police and people get scared and people get intimidated, they start to talk, but they don't have to answer a lot of questions. And so these are just some of the things that happen. Most people end up complying with the officers instead of knowing their rights and challenging their rights. Next slide, minor traffic violations is also another way in which law enforcement can use what they call a classic pretext stop to hunt for drugs. So what happens is they use what they call a traffic violation, which most of us commit traffic violations. You probably committed 5 of them this week alone. But police officers would then use this idea that, oh, they didn't use a turning signal, they did a rolling stop, whatever. And then come up to the car and see if they smell marijuana or they can see any drug paraphernalia. And then use that to then carry out their selective perception. They use that to then say, we need to be more aggressive in this approach. And that happened a lot. They just now passed a rule or a law stating in some states that that's illegal now. I think it's illegal in New York now. Just because a police officer comes up to a car and smells marijuana, that he cannot accuse them of having drugs, even if he smells it. Because oftentimes what they found is that police officers will come up to a car and say they smell marijuana, even if they didn't, and then use that to now check the car, pull gentlemen, ladies, whoever out of the car, search them, stop and frisk. So there was so much evidence to show that that would be used. These so-called minor traffic violations would be used to check mostly Black people. And then oftentimes what they would find is that these police officers would do this so much, and out of maybe 100, 10 may actually have drugs on them, and then they would arrest them, send them to court. The courts would then say, wow, using stop and frisk, using these efforts are working because the police officers are actually catching drug dealers. Oftentimes what they don't tell you, this goes into the next slide, kissing frogs, what they don't tell you is, yeah, he caught 10, but there were 90 of them that he frisked that didn't have anything on them. But those people often aren't included in the statistics. They're not included in the evaluation. So it seems like the cops have this sixth sense about these drug dealers, but they don't. If you kiss enough frogs, you'll find a prince. If you go after enough people, the few that you find, yeah, you'll find a few. But you harassed many, many, many more that were innocent. Right? Last couple slides. So also with any war, there has to be someone financing it. With any war, there is financing. And so financing the war on drugs took place during the Nixon era, when presidents and leaders would give cash advantage to precincts that made drugs and arresting drug dealers a higher priority. They would give them better equipment, they would give them more training, and they would give them more money. At the time, a lot of police precincts said drugs isn't actually our top priority right now. There's other things we need to worry about. But when they were told they would have these cash advances if they did, and they said, oh, drugs is a top priority. That is how the war on drugs was financed, right? You also have programs like the Burn Program. And it was named after a man who died protecting the home of a drug case witness. And this also encouraged the war on drugs. So you had one person who died in a drug-related incident, and this made people say, oh, we need to attack drugs head on. So these precincts began to get loaded with weapons and loaded with material and training that was actually only supposed to be used for real wars. And we'll get into that in a second. So every war needs weapons. So this is now when you have SWAT teams that are now being sent into predominantly urban Black communities to catch drugs. If you see documentaries and videos of Los Angeles in the 1980s and the 1990s, these are regularly residential neighborhoods. But in these neighborhoods, you see big tanks that were used in Iraq, that were used in Kuwait. They were using these tanks to come down residential neighborhoods to a regular house where these people would bust in a so-called drug dealer's home to get crack or get cocaine. These were weapons that were only used for hijacking prison escapes, big things. But now they're using grenades and tanks in people's homes to find drugs. So when you do that, machine guns and Uzis and all these different things that were used in big situations, you're using that to find drugs where people are living, where children are playing. Oftentimes, something negative is going to happen. Something bad is going to happen. I want you to watch this video. And in watching this video, I want you to see how and analyze in your head some of the effects of this war on drugs. Not just of the people that were so-called the perpetuators of it, the low-level drug dealers, but also how the police and how these larger structural forms of the president's financing these programs and passing policies that allow for these big weapons to come into these small areas, and even the misconception of drugs and drug users, how it leads to innocent people dying. So watch that video and then come back, and then we have like 2 more slides or a few more slides. All right, so where does all the drugs and money go? So once the property is seized, so you have a big time drug bust, once the property is seized, very few people ask, well, where does all that money go? He or she would have to prove the property's innocence, but most people who are arrested are poor, so they don't have the money to hire an attorney and pay court costs. And so we're seeing how class plays a role in what is happening. And what ends up happening is that a lot of state and local law enforcement agencies keep the assets that are seized. Keep the money. They don't give the police officers raises, but they keep the money. Sometimes they keep the drugs. And some people even argue they put the drugs back on the streets to now catch more and more drug dealers and drug users. And then even after that, then you have the legal system. And the legal system has a lot of holes in it, and there's a lot of racial disparities in the legal system because there is poor legal representation. particularly for people who are poor. There are particularly poor and Black people, people of color, are pressured into plea bargains, right? And so they're pressured to plead guilty, even if they're innocent, pressured to plead guilty. They plead guilty, take a longer sentence because of fear of mandatory sentences. They take a longer sentence, and then what happens is they may get a 2 to 3 year sentence as opposed to a 10 to 15 years. But then after that, they're on probation for another 20 years. So this is how that's why we included not just people who are incarcerated, but people who are on probation. They're still within the penal system, the legal system. They're still within the penal system. And so oftentimes what you find is if it's a young person who's now been caught up in some type of drug case, and they're scared, they want to go home, and then a lawyer comes in and says, hey, we caught you doing this, we caught you, your friends bailed on you, they turned you in, you're looking at 15 to 20 years. Say you're guilty, plead guilty, you'll do 3 to 5. If you're young and you don't know any better, you'll say, fine, give it to me. I'll take it. I can do 3 to 5 over 15 to 20, I'll take it. And then that's what happens. Even if you didn't do it. Because then what happens is, oh, you want to go to court where you're not going to see your court cases are going to happen for another 1 to 2 years. So you're still going to have to be in jail. And then when you go to court, you're costing everybody money. Now your lawyers mad, now the judges mad, now people are mad. You probably won't get a fair case. And if you're found guilty, now I got to spend 15 to 20 years there. I could have just did the 3 to 5. That makes sense to a lot of young people. I'll take the 3 to 5 or the 2 to 3. I'll take that. But they sit in jail, and then when they come out, many times they're on probation. Also, the punishment for drug offenses far exceeds the punishment in other countries. What people might go to jail for 6 months in another country, in the United States, they go to jail for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So then we talk about that, but then we also talk about life after prison. Okay, so you do your time, you get out. Now you're on probation. If you jaywalk, you're going back to prison. Meek Mill was a rapper. He got caught in a robbery case or something. He did his time when he was younger, 18, 19 years old. He did his time. He got out of jail, out of prison, but he was still on probation. He popped a wheelie. He was riding a bike, and he popped a wheelie. In the state of Pennsylvania, that's against the law. He was arrested and put back in prison, and he was looking at, I think, another 10 years. But he ended up doing a year or two, and he eventually got out because he had he was a big time rapper, and he also had big time representation from his label, Jay-Z, all these other people who came to his defense, as well as regular people who came to his defense, and he was able to get out. But everybody's not Meek Mill. Everybody may not have those connections. And you have a lot of people that are languishing in jail for years because of that system. Then if they get out, they're still under the penal system. That means they can't live in public housing, which a lot of people who are in jail probably come from poor areas where many of their family members or friends live in public housing. There's housing discrimination that exists. They're not eligible for food stamps. Many of them can't get jobs. Many of them are denied licenses. So there's a very small way of being able to get out of this cycle of poverty. So then what do many of them do? They go back to take the same risk that they took to go to jail before, get caught, and now they're back in the same system. That's why it's called a trap. And so it's very important that we understand the race, the criminal justice system, how this relates to race bodies, how this relates to policy, slavery, Jim Crow, economics. All of these things play a role in how we understand race in the criminal justice system. And there's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot that has been done, like the documentary 13th, documentary Slavery by Another Name, policies. Now that this has become mass incarceration and getting rid of the racial disparities in the criminal justice system has been a key element for political campaigns. Key element. And so now more and more people are starting to say, you need to do something about this. This is wrong. So there have been change. There has been some change for sure, but we need a whole lot more. Things have gotten a little better since the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, but we have a long way to go. All right, with that being said, all right, this has been very long, so I hope you can break this up if you need to. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, reach out, inbox me, email me, come into the office hours. Look forward to talking with you and hearing from you, and you will see me next week, and hopefully I'll see you in the office hours.